1991, following the victory by the United States and its coalition partners in removing Saddam Hussein's army from neighboring Kuwait, President George H.W. Bush stated, "We finally kicked the Vietnam Syndrome," during his victory speech. Now, for Americans at the time, they understood what President Bush meant by this statement. So I want to make sure first we take apart the word syndrome. Syndrome is not just the name of the primary villain in The Incredibles, but what it actually means is a group of signs and symptoms that in some way demonstrate some kind of abnormality or condition. So a syndrome is not a disease, it's more a pattern of behavior. So what exactly was this syndrome that President Bush was speaking about? Well, Americans understood what he meant by this at the time. So we're going to take a look and try to figure out what exactly he and Americans meant when they said Vietnam Syndrome. What you see here is the result of a poll given by the Pew Research Institute, and the poll that they've been giving consistently for the last 60 years. Participants were simply asked, do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time? So if you would pause the video for a moment and take a look and see what kind of patterns you see in the data. So looking at this, it's pretty clear that the percent of Americans who believe that the federal government is going to do the right thing all or most of the time peaks in 1964, 1965, somewhere around 75 to 80%. But beginning in 1965, there's a severe decline in support for what the federal government does to less than 30% by the end of the 1970s. Now, this time period encompassed 2 Democratic presidents, 2 Republican presidents, so wasn't strictly an issue of partisanship. From the 1980s to the present, support has only once, and that was very briefly in 2001, touched over 50%. So the question is, where did this decline in faith in the federal government to try to do the right thing come from? More to the point, what was going on in 1965? Well, 1965 was marked by several major developments. In 1965, Alabama troopers attacked peaceful protesters crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And despite the fact that this helped lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the splintering of the civil rights movement escalated in 1965. Also in the summer of 1965, a police stop of African-American Marquette Fry in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles turned violent, which escalated into the Watts riots, or the Watts Rebellion. This ultimately saw 14,000 National Guard troops being deployed to the neighborhood to stop mobs who were clashing with local police, who were destroying private businesses and private property. Ultimately, 34 citizens were killed, mostly local African Americans. And this was merely the largest in a series of urban riots in the late 1960s. 1965 also marked the beginning of the decline in the percent of Americans who believed the Warren Commission's finding that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in killing President Kennedy. And in 1965, the United States government began the escalation of the Vietnam War by sending in the first acknowledged ground troops. What then was it about Vietnam that encapsulated this syndrome, this doubt and lack of faith in our political institutions? So this unit that we're in right now, we're calling it a crisis in confidence. So we're looking at how the Vietnam War, civil unrest in the mid to late 1960s, and eventually Watergate led to this decline in confidence in the United States government. So what exactly was it about the Vietnam War? What was it about American attempts to protect South Vietnam from the Viet Minh, which were the North Vietnamese military, and to protect South Vietnam from the Viet Cong, who were Southern guerrillas? How did this contribute to this crisis in confidence? We're going to look at 3 different ideas about why this took place. The first was looking at the wisdom of employing the strategy of containment in Vietnam. Again, containment of communism. Increasingly, Americans questioned whether or not this was an appropriate strategy, whether it was appropriate for the United States to put increasingly numbers of American troops at risk in support of a non-democratic, again, non-communist, but non-democratic government, especially when there was no clear path to victory against what in theory was an outmanned and outgunned enemy in North Vietnam. Secondly, we're going to look at some of the tactics that were used to conduct the war and the ways in which some of these tactics eventually would challenge American values of democracy and of human rights. Third, and most significantly for our work, we're going to look at this idea of what came to be known as the credibility gap. We're going to look at the ways in which American policymakers repeatedly were be found to be misleading about exactly what was going on in Vietnam. What you see at the right of the screen here is a chart showing the number of Allied troops in Vietnam from 1960 to 1973. Again, I'm going to ask you to pause the video in a moment and look and see what kind of patterns you can see in troop levels, especially in American troop levels, in addition to some of our other coalition partners. So, in case you were wondering, SVN does stand for South Vietnamese, or the South Vietnamese military, but I'm hoping you're noticing a few patterns in here. The first being that from 1959 to 1963, the United States had troops in Vietnam, but Americans at the time didn't really think about it as a war. And in fact, the troops who were in Vietnam were termed military advisors, tasked initially with training and supporting the South Vietnamese military in their conflict against the Viet Minh, the North Vietnamese army, and against the Viet Cong. So from 1959 to 1963, we see troop levels that were increasing, but the numbers were really in the hundreds or in the thousands. At the left, you see a chronology of the same material that's been covered in your text, but I want to make sure that you kind of see it in a clear path since this information was really divided up among several different chapters. For some people, the American involvement in the Vietnam War goes back to the end of World War II. As Imperial Japan was defeated, Vietnam, which had fought for independence against Japan, was now concerned that they would be recolonized by the formal colonial power of the region, France. France wanted United States support in recolonizing Vietnam, which we did in the interest of developing an ally in the face of the Cold War. In 1954, the French military eventually is defeated by the Vietnamese, and they make for plans to pull out of Vietnam. Plans are drawn up to hold elections, to reunify the country, to create a single Vietnam, not North and South Vietnam. In 1956, though, the United States openly supports Ngo Dinh Diem as the president of South Vietnam, calling him a one-man democratic rule. Again, here, I'd like you to pause for a second and think about that phrase, a one-man democratic rule. Democracy, by its very definition, means that the people rule, not rule of a single person. So this phrase is clearly an oxymoron, a contradictory term. There can't be a one-man democratic rule. The United States works with Diem in opposing and essentially canceling national elections, knowing full well that most likely Ho Chi Minh, the leader of communist North Vietnam, was going to win the election. In 1959, the United States began sending those military advisors to support Ngo Dinh Diem and South Vietnam. In 1963, however, after years of repressive rule, the CIA eventually supports a military coup to overthrow Diem, to remove him from power, who was assassinated during the coup. And this is really the beginning of dramatically increased American involvement in Vietnam. So going back to the chart, I also hope you notice that in 1965 there was a dramatic increase from the previous year, and it continued to increase from 1965 to 1968. So the question is, well, why did these numbers increase so dramatically? In 1964, an event took place that comes to be known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which a U.S. destroyer, the Maddox, is fired upon, or the belief is that it's fired upon, off the coast of North Vietnam. Based upon the belief that the United States military had been directly attacked, Congress passed what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which essentially gave President Lyndon Baines Johnson a blank check to do whatever he thought was necessary to protect American troops that were already in the region. And this became the justification for what was known as escalation, going up from 23,000 troops in 64 to 180,000, to 380,000, to 480,000, and eventually over to over 500,000 troops by 1968. Escalation ended in 1968 following the Tet Offensive, a coordinated attack between the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong that kind of burst the American public's perception that we were in fact winning the war. The strange part of this is the offensive itself was defeated by the United States and South Vietnamese allies. But the impact upon the American public increasingly was one that the public did not feel like they had been told the truth about what had been taking place, and there were increasing questions over whether or not the war could be won as it was being fought. So what you hopefully notice also is that from 1968 to 1973 is a consistent de-escalation, or what policymakers at the time called the Vietnamization of the Vietnam War. In 1973, United States forces fully withdraw. The war does not end, merely our role in the war. And in 1975, the South Vietnamese government itself collapses.